Good evening.
Hello.
Hello. Hi. Sorry I didn't get to visit with you before because, my life is nuts. But it's so good to see you, Jeff. I love your new chair. That's very pretty.
Actually, it's the same one, just without the blanket on it.
Same chair, no
Yeah.
blanket.
Yep.
Okay. So are you telling me that the frozen tundra has thawed?
You know what? It actually has. It's about maybe 80 degrees out right now. So not bad.
Okay. It's 84 here.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
we're coming for you. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so good to see you. I feel like we've
You.
been apart for a long time. And the last time we did a show, we had one idea in mind and then it completely turned to another direction. And I didn't mean for that to happen, but it just did. And I looked at the clock and I was like, oh my God, our time is up. I mean, I don't even know how that happened. So we'll go back and we'll review and we'll do another show on that topic soon.
Sure.
What you sent me this morning was brilliant, and so I want to go there and really explore your idea for tonight's show. So with that, let's just announce that class is in session, and I will make one statement and one statement only to begin, so that you can just hit the ground running and explain what you sent to me this morning to all of our viewers. And I will start this class with one sentence, two sentences. I know how to be happy when I'm miserable. My mother taught me how.
Well, I would also like to say it's so good to be back with you. I've missed doing these. We did have a show a couple weeks ago. Well, I wasn't with you last week. The week before, Michael Carter was with me, and we did have a good conversation then as well. But
He's great.
he is.
Michael is great.
He is. He is. So that was enjoyable, but you know what? It's not the same. It's just not the same. Anyways, and I hope you had a good time in Alaska and everything else. And it's just, yeah, my parents were actually in Alaska the same time you were. So that was interesting little
Very
sync up.
cool.
Yep.
Wouldn't it be funny if they were on the same ship?
Yeah, I don't think they probably were though.
Okay. Well, what's
No.
interesting is my sister has been married for, oh gosh, maybe close to 40 years to my
Mhm.
brother-in-law. And he has a sister and brother-in-law that live out in Arizona.
Mhm.
And the two princess ships, I believe the Rotterdam and then the one that I was on, they travel together.
Hmm.
Basically, they stay a couple of maybe a mile or so apart, but they basically visit the same places at the same time. And I asked about that when we were on board, and they said that so if there's any kind of an emergency on one ship, the other ship can step in and help.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, that's brilliant. That's really smart.
Yeah.
About halfway through the trip, I found out once I was able to get a signal to call Georgia, because a lot of the time we had no internet, no phone signal. We were out in open ocean and we were in Canadian waters, and we were out of range of everything. And so when I finally was able to call home again, probably around Wednesday night or Thursday, I found out that my brother-in-law's sister and her whole family was on our sister ship.
Oh
And in
wow.
all the years that I've known my brother-in-law, I've never met that side of his family.
Hmm.
Because they've always, they live out in Arizona, and they don't come to paranormal conferences. So that's the only way I would have met them, unless I met them when they came to visit Georgia, which I was always away.
Yeah.
So I was about a mile away from my my sister's sister-in-law and her family
Huh.
on
Very
the open
interesting.
ocean, watching
Yeah.
the same whales playing between the two ships. It's
Hmm.
like, and what are the chances of that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
reason
what's
enough to go buy a lottery ticket.
and what's the meaning of it? I don't know, but every now and then you just hear the universe giggle. You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
it's
and that's what I said to her, and the
yeah.
universe laughed and
Yep.
laughed and laughed.
Yep.
I've never even heard her voice. I
Hmm.
don't know her or her family
Huh.
at all, and we were
Huh.
that close, and probably the closest that we'll ever be.
Huh. Interesting. The
Yeah.
cosmic giggle, I think Terence McKenna used to call it. Yep.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
it's a great notion, it really is.
for sure.
So anyway,
Yeah.
yeah, we're gonna start with
Yep.
what I think is a brilliant hypothesis
Hmm.
that you posited with me this morning,
Yeah.
and just explain it the way that you sent it to me. Explain it,
Yes.
including with the quotation or the
Absolutely.
yes.
Okay. So to say these thoughts are half baked might be giving them a little too much credit. We're talking this is still batter in the bowl a little bit. The whisk is still in there as well. These are just some thoughts I've been really meditating on lately. But great, a show like this and a conversation partner like yourself, it's a great medium for just hashing out ideas. And I really that's one thing I really appreciate about this hour is just the freedom to hash out and explore some of these ideas. So I've been thinking a lot lately. I've been thinking about the concept of memento mori, the Latin phrase meaning remember that you will die. Basically, it means
Mhm.
remember your mortality. It literally means remember that you will die,
Yeah.
and it's a call to meditate upon and consider the fleeting nature of life, the vaporous nature of life. Consider the fact that you won't be here forever, and many hear that, and in it they hear something dark, and in it they hear something grim. But what the Stoics knew is that that phrase actually has the power to liberate you to live a happy life. It really does, and we'll get there. But one of the things I was thinking about, because I've meditated on this for years, and it's a thought I've played with for decades now, but for whatever reason it really returned to me this last couple of weeks, and I've been really thinking about it, and I've been really finding a lot of peace in it. Now, not anything morbid, just peace in the fact of, like, instead of taking this thing that is in front of me so deadly seriously, instead I can almost join the universe in giggling by realizing memento mori. I'm not going to be here forever. This means very little. And so I've been meditating on that, and I began to think about my own Christian past and wonder, why weren't we ever taught this powerful principle? Because what we were taught was essentially, you're never going to die, right? We were taught that you will live forever because you believe the right way. And this isn't, I'm not here to rip on a belief. I'm just saying I'm looking back at my belief system, and I'm considering how what I was taught affected me versus how a thought like this affects me now. And the thought that I had was basically, you'll never die. You'll live forever in eternity. Death is not the end. Now, I still don't believe death is the end, and I don't think any of us probably who are viewing this think death is the end, whether we believe life carries on in some kind of
Spirit
heaven, or whether we
or
believe it.
another dimension. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, I think we're all probably believers in an afterlife. But the way that I was taught it was, you didn't really consider mortality, because mortality it had nothing on you. And that's because we were taught that because Jesus rose from the dead as the prototypical true human, that what became true of him would become true of all who followed him. And then later in universalist circles that I began to follow, it would just happen to everybody because it happened to the original fractal or the prototype. Now, I think that's a great idea. But I began to think about what that did. So, like our ancient forebears, our ancient ancestors, the specter of death always loomed large over in the background. It was always there. It was always haunting their every step, because, a sliver in your finger could kill you.
Yes.
Anything could take you
A,
out.
a queen died from the prick of a rose,
Yes, yeah,
from the thorn of a rose that got infected. Some great, I can't remember which one, but some great queen in and history died from the infection from the prick of the thorn of a rose.
yeah,
So yes,
precisely. An impacted tooth, anything, you name it, just something that we could just go to urgent care or very quickly have taken care of, and it's no big deal.
yeah,
It's just another scar on the arm. It's just another story to tell the kids. No big deal. Could have taken you out. Life expectancy 20, 25, depending on what century you're living in. I mean, People just did not live long lives. We live unnaturally long lives today. I guess you could actually say it is natural since we've developed the technologies to do it and we're part of nature. But I mean, this is a relatively
Yeah,
new phenomenon for human
it
beings to be
is.
living as long
It is.
as we live. Our ancient ancestors, life they knew. They've got 2, 3, 4 decades if they're lucky. You know, they knew they weren't here that long. Death was always there. It was always crouching at the door, to use the language of Genesis. And so there was very there were your brain had little else to do but to focus on survival, because survival was the main game you were engaging in, right? I mean, there really just wasn't a whole lot of time to contemplate existence and being and, you know, the more
Consciousness. Yep.
consciousness, and certainly more privileged folks were able to do those things. But
Scribes, yes, or even uh, the clergy.
yes,
That were really free to, the philosophers of the time,
right.
the mystics of the time, but there were a handful of them compared
Yeah.
with the rest of society.
And that's why we know who they are, because there were just a few of them. And but
Right.
most people were just afraid a saber-toothed cat was going to bite their head off. I mean, so most people are just looking over their shoulder constantly to see if they're about to get mauled by a lion or taken out by some natural disaster, whatever. I mean, it was death was always there, and it took all of your brain power to keep you alive,
Yeah.
right? And so then as technology develops, and I'll say even spiritual technologies, because okay, so I think there's a collective unconscious that connects all of humanity. The morphic field, to use Sheldrake's language, there
And
is, yeah.
the ancient part of us is
Mhm.
where fight or flight comes in. And
Yeah,
we all still have it today. All of
for
us have
sure.
it deeply ingrained in us.
Yep,
But that goes back to the origins of mankind,
absolutely. Yeah.
when you needed to make sure that you weren't under the foot of a woolly mammoth.
Yes.
I
Yep.
mean, really,
For real. Yep.
and all of that has transpired in the blink of an eye.
Yeah. I mean, stepping outside of your bearskin tent or whatever was taking your life into your own hands. You know, sleeping in the bearskin tent was taking your life. Everything existing was basically taking your life into your own hands. Okay, and so there is just this fear of death that all human beings share. And it takes most of our brain power just to stay alive. Concentrating on survival takes most of our brain power. Okay, so then a spiritual technology develops. It develops in the East in Buddhism and meditation and letting go and not fearing death. In
Mhm.
Christianity, because while I believe there's a collective unconscious, I believe there's like continents within that, where what the collective is learning collectively is
Yeah.
flavored and tinctured by whatever the philosophy and religious biases of a particular group are. So in the East, it looks like one thing. In the West, from Christianity, there emerges from Judaism into Christianity the idea of resurrection.
But
And
all
so,
still ritual, all falling into the category of
yep.
ritual.
But in resurrection, what we were given was this picture of a human being who has returned from the thing we fear the most.
Mhm.
And so here's one of our number who went where we fear, who's come back, who is alive, and is now the prototypical, the Son of Man, the true human, as many have interpreted that phrase. And so this means he's the prototype for what all will become. So one of the things that was notable about early Christians was that they faced death with a radiant joy. And it was remarked upon about how even while some of them were facing down their last moments in the Colosseum, their faces are shining brightly and they're singing hymns. And it was a phenomenon that no one had really ever witnessed the way they were witnessing it here, because the fear of death had lost its hold on these people, because their deity was a human being who was alive from the dead and who promised them, so you will be one day. And so that fear of death was destroyed in a way. It was undone in a sense. And then that spreads to the Western collective mind. At the very least, the Western collective mind, that idea kind of spreads. And then, of course, you have the development of technologies and science and medicine and what have you. And so now, today, really, death is not something that we spend a whole lot of time obsessing over in the way that our ancient ancestors did. Now, we all do in different ways, the existence of religion still probably proves we think of it, because Freud said as long as people fear death, there will be religion. But I guess my point is this: that kind of fear of death isn't what it was. And so now the brain is freed up to, instead of obsess constantly on survival, instead of every time you walk out your front door fearing, I don't know, either a spear is going to hit you in the chest from a rival tribe, or a woolly mammoth is going to put you under it, whatever. Instead, yeah, the world's still chaotic and wild and what have you, but it's not what it was. We live very comfortable lives. Even the most uncomfortable among us live very comfortable lives compared to our ancient ancestors. And so the brain is freed up. And we now have the privilege of worrying. We now have the privilege of stressing out about things that our ancient ancestors would have just shooed away like a bothersome gnat. Now those things burrow into our brains, and we can't get them. We obsess over things that, again, our ancient ancestors would have just shooed away. Like, what are you talking about? I have a family I have to keep alive. I have to keep myself alive. I have to hunt and have to have food. I have to make sure these crops grow. So our brains are now freed up to worry about things that previously they would not have had the power to worry about. And so now the fear of death that once sort of naturally freed us from worry when humanity was in kind of an infantile state, we now have to make ourselves conscious of that because we've now overcome it, right? We've overcome that fear, but now we have to return to it, but not as a fear, but as a meditation on mortality. So it's kind of like Paul Ricoeur's idea of a second naivete, like in the human, right? You grow up with a belief, you lose it, but then you come back to the belief, but not in a naive way. You come back to it in a conscious way. You're now conscious of all of its flaws and the things that are wrong with it, but you realize there's some meaning to be had there. And so you turn it to it in that way. So the fear of death in humanity's infancy, it was kind of like a faith you're brought up with or something, and then we overcome it through religious tradition, through science and medicine. And then it frees us from the fear that once held us captive every second of every minute of every hour of every day. But then in freeing us, it also introduces us to the ability to worry and stress about things that might not really be worth the brain power we're expending worrying and stressing out about them. And so a return to the meditation on death, or the contemplation concerning mortality that once just used to be all you could do because it was just what you had to do to live, it's now something we have to make a deliberate practice.
Conscious effort. Yep.
Conscious effort to look at it, to stare at it, and meditate on the fact that I will not exist on this planet in this form forever. So are the things that in this moment I'm worrying myself to death, quote unquote, about, are they worth it? Is it worth the brain power and the heart power that I'm expending to spend the next hour worrying about this issue that is probably going to remain the issue it is an hour later, whether I worry about it or not, right? And when you contemplate the fact that, yeah, man, I'm tired. I worked today. I'm taking a few days off last week, so I put in a little bit of extra time to prep and make sure, my little segment of that company doesn't go to hell in my absence, but that doesn't mean when I come home, I don't still spend time with the ones that I love, because I'm not promised I'll be here tomorrow. Tomorrow is a word only found in a fool's calendar, a very wise preacher once said, and so I'm not promised that I'll have that. But if I let that sense of immortality that comes either from religion, or maybe the religion even of scientism, like just believing that somehow that can keep me alive forever, I could very well set that aside or sit and worry about something that's not worth the time, because I'm not taking into account my own mortality. Now, if you want to interject, please go ahead. I want to bring it back to the poem I sent you as well.
Yes.
Poem.
If you would recite that.
Absolutely. And so I was thinking about this, and it's hard because I know when people hear this, they think, well, that just sounds awfully morbid, right?
Mhm.
But the sign you'll often see in paintings and depictions a philosopher, or even you'll see it, monks in their cells would have a skull oftentimes. And growing up in the tradition that I grew up in, that always seemed very macabre and dark and like antithetical to Christianity, because wow, a symbol of death, what? But these people understood something about the skull that we don't understand, and that is that the skull is always smiling. And so when you really face down mortality, what you're left with is joy. So here's a poem from Chesterton. I love Chesterton.
So do I.
But it's a poem called The Skeleton. And he writes, chattering finch and waterfly are not merrier than I. Here among the flowers I lie, laughing everlastingly. No, I may not tell the best. Surely, friends, I might have guessed. Death was but the good king's jest. It was hid so carefully. Now, there's so much there to unpack, and so much of that hit me when I read it. But the last two lines, particularly so. Death was but the good king's jest. It was hid so carefully. Now, the imagery here is so beautiful. This is a skeleton saying, look, nothing out there in nature is as merry as I am, because when I was stripped of everything that I thought was me, that maybe brought me down and caused these muscles to droop this way instead of rise this way, when all of that was stripped away, I found all I was left with was a smile. The skull is always smiling. That's what it is. When you strip everything else away, there's joy there. And so contemplating mortality, right? Contemplating one's mortality, that's the end result of it. And that's just a metaphor for it, of course. And there's beautiful ways to speak of death. Khalil Gibran, the prophet, when El Mitra asks him, speak to us of death. I think it's one of the last things he's asked to speak on before boarding the ship, right? He says something like, what is it to die but to, what's the words? What is it to die but to stand naked in the wind and be melted into the sun? I mean, what a beautiful way of speaking of something that causes us such pain. But there is beauty in this thing that we see only darkness in, right? And contemplating mortality, it shouldn't lead one into this depressed state. And I think those who do haven't looked long enough. So there's the famous Nietzschean aphorism, the one who fights monsters, take heed, lest in fighting them you become them. I've always thought to myself, like, I don't think the one who becomes a monster in fighting monsters has fought monsters hard enough. Right. And I don't think one who stares into the void and finds themselves consumed by the void has stared into the void long enough, because if you stare long enough, you see light, right? If you fight monsters long enough, you realize, the best revenge, I think Epictetus said, is to not become the monster. And so that's the last thing you would become, if you really were battling a monster. And so there's a phrase I often think of, that nothing is meaningful, right? Nothing is meaningful. And if you think on that long enough, well, at first it'll depress you, because you'll think, nothing is meaningful. Nothing has any meaning to it. That's how you hear it the first time around. Nothing is meaningful. And then it gets worse. And nothing is meaningful. So nothing I do has any meaning. And then you fall into that kind of Nietzschean nihilism that he writes about in Beyond Good and Evil. And eventually some people even become the sort of nihilist Nietzsche writes of, that, what does he say? They actually put their shoulder to the plow in helping things deteriorate. And they give entropy a little push, because they're so convinced of the meaninglessness of all things that they want to watch everything burn. But if you
we're in that phase right now, by the way.
And I think we are. Yes. You can see it. I think if we're being objective,
it's palpable. Oh my God, it's palpable.
And I think you can see it in every corner, both sides of the binary. You can see that, a desire just to watch the other side burn
it down. Yep.
And there's that great line from The Dark Knight, the second of Christopher Nolan's Batman movies, where they're talking about how do we stop the Joker, basically, who's a nihilist, who, if you look at it from the perspective of philosophy, he kind of is Nietzsche's nihilist in a way.
Yes.
And Alfred, Batman's butler, tells him a story about how there was once a bandit they were after who was stealing precious stones, and they found that he was just throwing them away, and they were like, well, why steal them? And he's like, because some men don't want things that you think people want. Some people just want to watch the world burn, right? And so that was the nihilist. And so then Batman asks him, he's like, how did you stop him? And he's like, we had to burn the forest down. And, you know, so I think some people, they're so convinced that the only way that if I have to burn the whole forest down and hurt myself in the process, that's what I'll do, because we're that convinced that the other side has to be done away with. We're willing to like Samson push the pillars down of the temple that we're chained to if we
Yep.
have to. And
Or
so
cut the baby in half to settle the
there
argument.
you go. Perfect example. Yep. So that is definitely where we're at. But I still think it's because we just haven't looked long enough. Because if you keep looking at it, nothing is meaningful. Eventually, it's like that picture, one of many pictures, but where from one side it kind of looks like an old hag, but then if you look at it from another angle, it's a young like maiden, right?
Yes.
That phrase becomes something else. Nothing is meaningful. If you look at it long enough, and it starts to sound different, and you're like, wait a minute, nothing is meaningful. Oh, the nothing itself is meaningful, right? It isn't that nothing means anything. It's that the nothing that comes about as a result of looking into the darkness long enough and realizing that, yeah, the world is chaotic, right? Oh, yeah, there is chaos. Everything is a bit shit at the moment, you know, and ultimately maybe it all will be. I don't know. But there is something that
And maybe
happens.
it already, and maybe it always has been.
Yeah.
But we didn't live in an age of social media. We didn't live in an age of 2000
Yes.
television stations and movie theaters and radio. And,
Yes.
you know, we didn't live in an age of global communication.
Yes.
So, you know, maybe 1,000 years ago, all the same crap was going on.
Mhm.
But nobody knew about it
Yeah.
from the other side of the world.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then eventually we realize like that nothing itself contains meaning, right? The
Mhm.
nothing is meaningful. The skull that we think represents the macabre and the dark is smiling, because the end result of death is a smile in some bizarre way. It's the king's jest, to use Chestertonian speak.
Mm.
And I don't know. I've been really thinking on that today and in the last several weeks in terms of life, and I've been thinking about it in terms of the micro mini deaths that we all die 1,000 times, you know, over the course of a year or a decade, and how each and every one of those micro deaths themselves, if we, again, this sounds morbid until we look at it long enough, if we actually allow ourselves to die in that process instead of fighting, and I don't mean die like give up. I don't mean die like, you know, give up and surrender to whatever it is that's trying to kill us. I mean, because we're in soul school, right? So I believe when things like that come along,
Mhm.
there are things in us that are being put to death that need to die, right?
Mhm.
So that other things in us can come forth, right? Dead wood is being burned up. So actual, you know, the potential can come forth. I believe that wholeheartedly. And so if we allow ourselves in those times of, you know, facing down of micro deaths to actually die and to not fight it and hold on, we will see that the skull smiles. And along the way, we learn joy, you know, and we learn what it is to be happy in the most dire and dour of circumstances, because we know what lies beneath the quote unquote flesh of whatever it is that is dying in our lives. We know the end result is the king's jest and a smile, but we have to let the process happen. But it's hard when we see death as being only the nothing is meaningful, in the sense of, oh, nothing means anything, because we haven't stared long enough to realize that no, 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 no. What's being said is that the nothing itself is meaningful, that no matter what it is that's happening, we can mine meaning from it and we can
That's
find
right.
beauty in it. And it's
Yes.
kind of like, you know, and actually that's what makes it a beautiful story. That's what makes it beautiful. It's like if your grandpa just sat you down one day and told you a story about how he went to the grocery store and came home with, you know, 10 bags of groceries, you wouldn't really be thrilled or regaled by the tale, because grocery getting is what one does at a grocery store. If, however, he told you a story about how he went to a grocery store and ended up seeing a young woman whom he found attractive, and she looked at him in a way that suggested she found him attractive, and they struck up a conversation, and voila, hey kids, that's actually your grandma, and that's how we met. Well, Grandpa went to the store to get groceries, as did Grandma, but instead they found each other. Now that's a story, all right? Because you went somewhere to do one thing, but something totally unexpected happened, right? And
Mhm.
so it's not really a great story if you just do what you're supposed, if you just get groceries. And so it's not really a good story if in the midst of nothingness you just sink into it and become one with it and absorbed by it and decide you're going to show the whole world how nothing means anything and become some, uh, arsonist, deconstructionist philosopher who just goes around telling kids, philosophically speaking, that there is no such thing as Santa Claus. Well, great job, buddy. you know. So that's not really a good story if the darkness of the world makes you dark. But if you go into the darkness, like your grandpa went into the grocery store, and you walk away in love
And in
and
light
in light,
and enlightened.
then
Yes.
that's a story.
Yeah. And then
That's a
that's the
story.
story.
Mm,
I find so much in our society in this day and age is very perfunctory. It's performative. It's just so superficial in so many ways.
yeah.
Um, and it it distresses me because I have always found meaning in everything.
Mhm.
I believe that it was Einstein said, what is it? Either everything, I don't know. Oh God, either everything is sacred or nothing is sacred.
Hmm.
And he came down, and I don't know if it's the word sacred. Somebody needs to check that for me. I've got it. I've got the quote in one of my books, but
Yeah.
um, it is, and he came down on the side of, everything has value, everything has meaning, everything is a life lesson, everything is your next coping skill, everything is the obstacle for you to get around or under or over in your pursuit of your higher best self, of your being and your evolution
Mhm.
in this life. I just looked over to check to, see how my peanut butter cup is doing.
Mm,
And her face is kind of smushed on the pillow a certain way that's
mm,
utterly charming.
mm,
And the instant that my eyes landed on her, I felt a whoosh
mm.
of joy.
Yeah.
Joy.
Yeah. I just read, I was looking back in some like journal entries of mine the other day, and just like what you said, there was a moment I was pushing my daughter on the swing. This had to have been 7 years ago now, probably. And I remember I was really in a dark time. I was really depressed. And it was just, I've told my story before and some of the struggles I had in the past with religious deconstruction and whatnot. But I remember this particular time, it was, it was about 2 weeks, and I just didn't know what happened to me. I was like, what in the world? It was really, and I couldn't snap myself out of it. But I was pushing her on the swing, and we're laughing and talking and whatever, doing what dads and daughters do when they're on swings. And I pushed her this one time, and like the view you had of your dog just in that moment, she laughed in a way that sounded like just something wild. I just don't even know how to explain it, but I can still hear it. And just the way it came out of her mouth, it was like I saw it, like something shot out of her, and it hit me, and that thing just lifted off of me, and it was gone in a moment. And it's like, God, isn't it amazing how you can just encounter reality in moments like that? What lies beneath the surface, but what really is actually just what's always on the surface, and just those moments you see it. God, I love it.
I
Sorry,
love
when you said that, I just connected that
Yeah,
memory to it
oh,
because I
no,
was
I
just
think
reading
that's
about it.
perfect. It's
Yeah.
perfect and beautiful. It's a
Mm,
wonderful metaphor, a perfect analogy. I
mm,
was sitting earlier with my mother. It's why I was almost late to my own show tonight. Because she wanted to know what you and I were going to talk about on Soul School, and it wasn't enough for me to tell her that I would play it for her tomorrow. Once
mhm,
she was awake in the morning, and we'd have coffee, and I could just put it on my phone, and she could watch it in bed. She wanted to know
mm,
what we were going to talk about, and I told her, how I opened the show. I said, well, we're going to talk about how I can even feel happy being miserable because you taught me how. And
mm,
she just laughed out loud, and
mm,
she said, yes, but what I really taught you was that, you call it Soul School, but whatever you call this life experience, and I'm paraphrasing because she did ramble on a little bit about it, but whatever you call this or want to call this life experience, I just told you to not withhold anything,
Mm.
to feel everything.
Yeah.
That's the reason why we're here, to feel everything.
Mm.
So I can sit here and know that mom's 2 rooms away and she's in bed and settled for the night, but she's really struggling and she's having a lot of physical difficulties, and we all know what this is.
Mm.
And I can be sad about that right here, from that room to this room, and in your presence and in the presence of everyone else, and
Mhm.
then be joyful that Peanut is sitting right there looking at me with the biggest, brownest, most lovely eyes, just looking at me like, "Are you talking about me again?"
Yeah. Mm.
And I can feel all of that
Yeah.
simultaneously.
Yeah.
And everything else, I can still sit here right now and be pissed at Putin. I
Mhm.
can still right now be, angry about this, or
Mm.
upset about that, or worried about that, or happy about this, or joyful about that, and
Yes.
have all of that swirling smoke of our existence just be what is left off by
Yes.
the fire of my own being interacting with the light of my own being,
Yeah.
interacting with the air of my own being,
Mm.
interacting with the earth of my own being,
Mm.
here, now,
Yes.
in this moment, and smile.
Mm. Yeah. I'm I'm reminded of this as you're saying it, and I referenced it earlier, but it's comes at the close of The Prophet, a book I know we both love,
Love.
by Khalil Gibran. And
Yeah.
of course, if you don't know it, there's this prophetic figure who's getting ready to depart, who's been among a certain people for a long time, and they begin to ask him questions about all things, and he just gives them wisdom on whatever it is they ask him about. And so the book is almost like a reference book. Whatever you're going through, you can find
You can find
on love, on death, on whatever. And I was reading in my on my meditations on mortality, I read the section on death. And if I just can read it real quick, because
Yeah.
there's something so beautiful. It says, "Then El Mitra spoke, saying, 'We would ask now of death.' And he, the prophet in the tale, says, 'You would know the secret of death, but how shall you find it unless you seek it in the heart of life? The owl, whose night-bound eyes are blind unto the day, cannot unveil the mystery of light. If you would indeed behold the spirit of death, open your heart wide unto the body of life, for life and death are one, even as the river and the sea are one. In the depth of your hopes and desires lies your silent knowledge of the beyond, and like seeds dreaming beneath the snow, your heart dreams of spring. Trust the dreams, for in them is hidden the gate to eternity. Your fear of death is but the trembling of the shepherd when he stands before the king whose hand is to be laid upon him in honor. Is the shepherd not joyful beneath this trembling, that he shall wear the mark of the king? Yet is he not more mindful of his trembling? For what is it to die but to stand naked in the wind and melt into the sun? And what is it to cease breathing but to free the breath from its restless tides, that it may rise and expand and seek God unencumbered? Only when you drink from the river of silence shall you indeed sing, and when you have reached the mountaintop, then you shall begin to climb, and when the earth shall claim your limbs, then shall you truly dance. Good God, could he write? But
Yeah.
oh,
Whew.
I got chills just.
I know. I know. I sweat.
Mhm. Yeah. I'm
I
sweating too, but
sweat.
it's heating up
Whenever I'm
back here
I
too.
sweat.
Yeah.
It's like my
Mm,
brain goes into
mm.
boiling mode. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. But even in that, though, there is the lesson of death and life coexisting. As you say, in one room, there's this, but here, there's this.
Yeah.
And they're both here, and you're in the presence of them both, and you can smile. And That's powerful. That's powerful.
It is.
And that comes about as a result of having faced thousands of micro deaths in one's life and learning the secret of the death is that there is life and that the skull is always smiling when all is said and done, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you know a person who can face death literally, metaphorically, and they can do so with a smile is a person who's already died many times. And that's why they're not afraid of it. That's why they face it with a smile, is because they've already known it in miniature.
Yeah.
And they know the end result.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, they know there's pain. You know, the scripture says, though weeping endures for the night, joy comes with the morning, right? But they also know the joy does come in the morning. It always does. And you can't have one without the other. I can't clap with one hand, right? In order to make a sound, there have to be two. So there need to be both of these realities for anything to actually even happen. For reality to be, you need both. You know?
Yeah. We had a bizarre thing that happened here today. Um, I don't know if you know, but Christine had 4 cats, and then she had 3, and then she had 2, and then she had 1. 3 of our 4 cats were quite old and passed away in the last couple of years. And we lost the last one a couple of months ago. Spooky Shoes, but was our sweet girl. Well, that left Mama Kitty, who was found and rescued as feral.
Mm.
And she's been domesticated now and been living in the house for 5 or 6 years. And she and Christine are very close. But she's still got that wildcat in her.
Mm-hmm.
And she goes out during the day on nice weather days. And she came home with a chipmunk this afternoon. And I was so angry because, what did that chipmunk ever do to you? You're as well fed as any cat on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was angry about her exercising her innate instincts to kill the little creatures that run around this yard that I love the most. And
Yeah.
I was just, and I just yelled, God damn it. God damn it. I said, Christine, you're going to have to put a bell on that cat or something, or she's just going to have to stay relegated to the porch. This is awful. This is awful. This was like the 3rd one this summer.
Yeah.
And Chris is like, yeah, I don't know what to do with it. I mean, it was just like, we were both upset. And she had picked up the little chipmunk and laid it. It was on, of course, right in front of the door on the back porch as a gift to Christine from Mama Kitty.
Right.
And Chris went out there and just ripped her a new one and made her, get in the house and go in your bed, and, was really angry with her. And she picked up the chipmunk and she laid it on a little towel and came and told me about it. And when she went back to take the chipmunk out to bury it, its tail had moved. And she saw no signs of life at all in this chipmunk. But then she saw that its tail had moved.
Mm-hmm.
And so she picked it up. I swear to God, Jeff, my sister starts giving the chipmunk CPR. Okay. She really did, and she's doing the compressions on its little chest and right up its nose. And all of a sudden it moved. And I'm not saying she necessarily brought the chipmunk back to life.
Yeah.
Might have. I mean, I believe in miracles. I do.
Sure. Yeah.
And I had taken, God's name in vain. I was so pissed off about it. And she's like, and she started, and all of a sudden its little feet started to move, and then its tail twitched a little, and she's like, and she's screaming, I'm over on this deck, she's over on that porch, and I hear Christine screaming, It's alive! It's alive! Not only did I get the flashback of Frankenstein,
Right.
but I'm like, yay! I knew what I mean, we went from angry and pissed and frustrated and what are we going to do about this cat to joy, an explosion of joy.
Mm.
And, whether she saved it or whether it was playing dead to try to save itself, we'll never know. But
Yeah.
she made an effort
Yeah.
to bring life back into this beautiful little creature,
Hmm.
and something worked,
Yeah.
and he's okay, and
Yeah.
off to the woods you go.
Mm.
And I know in the grand scheme of things that's probably like the most stupid story, but that has meaning to me.
Yes.
It really is a coming together,
Hmm.
a melding of
Hmm.
all those emotions within just a 2 to 3 minute period of time,
Yeah.
where both of us, felt like crying, screaming, pounding our fists, uh, chastising the cat, saving the chipmunk. No, I can't save him. Then saving the chipmunk. I mean, all of that all transpired within like a 2 to 3 minute period.
Yeah. Mm.
Um, and it really does, I think, embody what we're talking about.
Mm.
It was life, it was death, it was afterlife, it was, I mean, it was everything. It was everything all rolled into one thing. And
Yeah.
what do I say
Mhm.
all the time, probably ad nauseum to everybody listening to our show, is everything is one thing.
Mhm.
Everything is, give it whatever label you want, whether it's energy or it's consciousness or it's existence, it's, you know, um, cosmic forces, you call it whatever you want. It is. And it
Yes.
all exists simultaneously.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's another Chesterton poem, "The Million Masks of God." You know what I mean? Things appear as many things, but they're one thing, right? They really do. And the whole experience of life and death are one thing.
Yeah.
They're all, it's one experience. And then that experience, when you zoom out, is a corporate experience, you know, and it's what keeps this entity that we are corporately an entity, and even the cat bringing the chipmunk is to the cat an act of love, it
Yes.
just, in its
Yeah.
level of consciousness,
She
that's what
doesn't
it's
think she's
doing.
doing anything wrong.
Yeah, and proud as a peacock or a mother cat, is just proud as she can be. And I was always the same way with my cats. Like I remember the cat brought in a bird one time. The bird was not as lucky as the chipmunk, I'll put it that way. And I just remember my wife was like, she was freaking out because it was a disaster. I'll just put it that way. It was a disaster. And she was like screaming and crying. I was still asleep. And I woke up to somebody screaming bloody murder in the living room. And I come running out, probably in my back boxer shorts, my t-shirt half on. I'm like, what's going on? And there was a bird. We'll put it that way. My wife's screaming, but at the same time, she's petting the cat because this was like her best friend and saying, "Oh, I love you, buddy. Thank you so much." And then she's like, "Oh my god!" It was like
Oh,
this
it's half
mix,
eaten and it's still alive. Oh, Jesus Christ. Yeah. Yep. I
this
know.
mixture of emotions going on here. But it was like, even in that moment, she's still acknowledging, "I understand you're trying to give love here. So even though this is tearing my heart out and grossing me out, I." Whatever. Anyways, it's all one experience. It really is. And we segment it, we break it up. And I think we have to, if we experience, it's like I always say about eternity. I think I think time is eternity filtered, and reality as we know it is the one thing, call it God, call it whatever, that has to be filtered to us so that we don't experience it all at once. Time exists so we don't experience everything at once. Instead,
Yeah.
we experience things that play out linearly, and I think if we learn, there's a great movie called The Rival. If anyone's ever seen it, it's based on a book, but in it, aliens land basically, and they come and give us the gift of their language, and their language is non-linear. So for us, well, depending on your culture, you start on the right end of the left or left and right, whatever, but it's still linear. You move in a line. So
Mhm.
it teaches your brain to think in terms of beginnings and ends. But the language that these extraterrestrials give to humanity is a circular language, and it's all bound up in this circular, well, language pattern. And when the linguist who's trying to crack the code of their language learns it and begins to think in it, all of a sudden, like, her capacities like become unlocked, and she begins to think instead of linearly. She begins to think in terms of everything at once. And
Mhm.
spoiler alert, but it's been out for a while, so I'll give you 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Basically, things in the movie that you thought happened at the end, you realize happened at the beginning, and things you thought happened at the beginning happened at the end. And you were seeing it through how this language was unlocking her mind. And so, yes, everything is one thing, but we see it segmented. But I think that we can even learn a spiritual language. The Bible, for example, talks about learning to speak spiritual truths in spiritual words. That there's new, if you learn a new language to communicate a new truth, it unlocks your ability to think about these things. And so, even conversations like we're having right here, right now, tonight, have the power to unlock people's capacity to see life within death. You know,
Yes.
to see in the midst of what looks like the worst thing ever, to
Mhm.
see the grinning skull, to
Yeah.
see the king's jest in the midst of what seems like the end of the world, and then also in the midst of life, to stop and still be able to contemplate mortality and
Mhm.
death and still have it result in joy. And I think we can learn a new language, and we can learn to think a new way, and we can actually begin to experience these two polarities as one thing. Anything that exists on a pole is one thing, right? If
Right.
it exists, at one end of the thermometer versus the other, it's still a thermometer. It's a pole, and
Mhm.
it can move up and down very rapidly depending on where you place it, right?
Yep.
And the Kabbalion teaches that wonderfully, the law of polarity, if anyone's interested in reading up on that. But anyways, those are my
Well,
thoughts.
we're just about out of time, and so I hope that this was a lesson for all of us, that it was beneficial for everyone.
Mhm.
I'll just say what I always say, but this time with a preface. Be not afraid of the darkness.
Mhm.
Be the light that you seek. And,
Mhm.
so with that said, my darling friend, I love you. I love our viewers. I love our listeners, because love is our superpower, and we should use it as liberally as humanly possible for the time that we have in Soul School. And with that, I say to all of you, class dismissed.
Peace.